And in doing so, then it made us assess our trees. Obviously, trees are important to many cemeteries, but because people want to be buried next to that tree. There's a need for that. It beautifies our properties. Yes, they drop leaves, Greg, I know. There's lots of work dropping the leaves and the sweet gumballs and all that, and the acorns and stuff. But they do bring beauty to our property. So we also then assessed our property. We knew that because of many issues, mainly climate change, just age of trees, and just things that happened over the last 50 years of Lakeview, that we were starting to lose some of our grand trees. And that's a huge concern, because if you haven't been to Lakeview, that's what Lakeview is. We've got some beautiful old trees, and we're losing them. And we're not replacing them fast enough. We didn't replace them fast enough to plant in years before to now we've got these big gaps. So we saw the tide of what's happening with the city, but in a little part of our community, obviously. So we bought into the plan, and now we've used Davey to assess our property, and then we're now working on the plan our own plan to increase our tree canopy. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. All right, so yep, as our next speaker is coming up, any questions while we wait for him to get plugged in here? So our next speaker is Stanley Gert. He is a professor of wildlife ecology at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at the Ohio State University. He is also an extension wildlife specialist. He will be speaking on coyote use of cemeteries, the risks and rewards. Coyotes represent the largest mammalian carnivore inhabiting most cities across North America, and they often use cemeteries. We do have coyotes at Lakeview. Anybody else have coyotes? Yeah. For the past 16 years, they have been investigating the urban ecology of coyotes in the Chicago area, including capturing and tracking over 1,000 individuals. In this presentation, he will discuss how coyotes use cemeteries, what value cemeteries pose to coyotes, and the relative benefits and costs they represent for cemetery managers and visitors to the cemeteries. So please welcome Stanley Gert.
Thank you.
You all set?
I think so. It's
you don't have coyotes in your properties, you will have coyotes in your
Thank you. All right, sorry about that. So as you mentioned, I'm a principal investigator of research that we're doing over in Chicago. I've been doing that over the last, we just finished our 16th year, so we're into our 17th year of coyote research in Chicago. And it's not geared specifically to coyotes and cemeteries, but that is something that they use quite a bit. So I thought, since there was questions about coyotes and cemeteries and management of coyotes, that I would just pull out some of the results that we have specific to the kinds of questions that you guys may deal with, because they definitely benefit from cemeteries, whether you want them there or not. They're benefiting. So I'll go over that a little bit. Let's see. Before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about where the coyotes come from, how do we have them now, and why are you likely, just as she said, we're about to have a lot more. Cemeteries, as judges mentioned in the previous presentation, are great refuges for wildlife, especially in the more metropolitan or heavily developed areas. So the higher the degree of urbanization, the more important cemeteries are for a variety of species. And what I'll show you is that it doesn't matter for coyotes where you go in that landscape. You can go into downtown Chicago if you provide just the tiniest bit of green space, coyotes will find it, and they will use it. And you'll see how they do that in just a little bit. But if they do make it into your cemeteries, then they do cause fear in people, especially when they become diurnal and they become active during the day. Even though their risk is very low, people don't know that, and so it's a scary thing to see a predator running past while you're putting flowers down on the ground or something. So they can cause property damage. They don't. It's rare. In fact, I've never had a complaint from the cemetery about property damage by coyotes, but we have seen it. We did have one case of a coyote that was burrowing underneath headstones, so it was creating dens. But most of the time they don't do that. In fact, one of the misconceptions people have about coyotes is that they use dens year-round, or that dens are important to them, and in fact they hate them. They don't like to use them, except for when they're raising young. And so they will start, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, they will begin using dens, but only for about 6 weeks. Just long enough to raise the young, and then they get rid of there. So property damage is not usually a big issue, but what gets most of the attention is that they may attack pets, and even it's rare, but it does happen, especially this time of year. And then even more rarely, we do have a few instances of coyotes biting people. We haven't had any instances in Chicago, but I'll talk about that in more detail in just a little bit. So where did they come from? This is their historic range prior to European colonization of North America. So they were mainly a Midwestern and mainly a Southwestern desert species. They just barely creeped up into Canada and stopped somewhere in mid-Mexico. That was back in the 1600s. And then, especially in the last 100 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the range. And so they've more than doubled their range across North America. And again, most of that range increase has been in the last 100, in fact, and most of it's been in the last 50 years, when we've actually had the greatest amount of persecution. So coyotes are not protected. They've never been protected in their history anywhere. So there's no regulations that limit people in terms of how many they can kill or when they can kill them. And in fact, there were poisoning campaigns during most of those decades using compound 1080 and strychnine and some other poisons that are highly restricted now, but back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s they weren't. And all that happened was that coyotes increased in number and increased their range. So it's an important lesson for what I'm going to be talking about a little bit later. Here in Ohio, of course, they're not native. They expanded their range to the eastern states. And the first recorded case of a coyote in Ohio was in 1919, but they really didn't get established in the state until the 1970s and 80s. And even then, they were still relatively rare. There was a harvest that took place, that began in the 70s, but it was pretty minimal. It was during the 1990s when we really saw a major increase. So these are numbers that are recorded by the Division of Wildlife from bow hunter surveys, and they're the best, most unbiased indicators that we have about their population. So they're not useful for estimating the number of coyotes, but they do give us trend lines for coyotes, and you can see that there's been an increase in recent years. These are harvest numbers, and so these are the actual number of coyotes harvested in Ohio each year. And you can see that there are basically none of them, or very few, until the very late 1970s, and then it fluctuated a little bit in the 1980s. That's actually when pellet prices were at their highest. But you can see that the number of coyotes taken was actually pretty low, so we really didn't have that much of a population. But again, it was the 90s is when they really started taking off, and have continued to increase in number. So of course they're very common now, and there's debates as to whether they're still increasing or if they've plateaued. But in any case, we have a lot of coyotes, more now than we've had in the past. And most recently, and Ohio's not special, Ohio's typical of all the eastern states. So all eastern states show the same pattern across the eastern US and eastern Canada, same thing. And now even going south, so they're expanding the range southwards, and now they've moved all the way through Central America. And just in the last 2 years, they have their first records of coyotes that have passed across the Panama Canal. So now they are the very first records ever of coyotes in South America. So now they have a whole other continent that they can expand across. So the last remaining habitat for them to really exploit was cities, but now they've pushed their way into cities in the last 20 years. So all major metropolitan areas across North America, including New York City, which was the last major city to receive coyotes, we all have resident coyotes now, to varying degrees. Some cities have more, some have less, but all of them have resident coyotes now. And so coyotes are taking advantage of metropolitan areas, are extremely adaptive, and so they're beginning to learn how to use cities in new and novel ways. So this is my study area, so this is Chicago. So we're looking at about 9 million people. So if you take Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, the metro areas, and roll them all together, you still won't have as many people as we have in Chicago. So it's a major metropolitan area, and coyotes were not there when Chicago first began developing in the early 1800s. It's only after we got 9 million people living there that coyotes had moved in. So keep in mind, again, they haven't been protected. They're not protected anywhere in Chicago. In the first cases of coyotes moving in, there was a lot of effort to get rid of them. That's usually the normal course. So most cities around here, in the early years of coyote expansion, try to get rid of them, and then they give up after a while. So Chicago's kind of in that give up stage. So this is where our study area is, and you're probably familiar with O'Hare. So O'Hare would be right here. You can see the runways. So it's in the middle of where we study most of our animals. This is the road system, all the major roads, and so any terrestrial mammal that's going to move into a city has to be able to navigate roads. And so coyotes have figured out how to do that. And if I have time, I'll show you that. I know some people came here to see that. That wasn't part of my cemetery thing. So I have it here, but if you're curious, I can show you. But they do learn traffic patterns, and they learn how to cross the roads. And I'll show you, they use rail lines pretty heavily too, and you will get to see some of that. So we capture animals, we capture them the same way that fur trappers catch them, using the same traps, the same strategies, only in the city it's a lot harder. When we capture an animal, we ear tag them, we collect measurements, and we collect blood and fecal samples for disease work as well as genetic work. And we collect whiskers, and if I have time, I'll show you. We can actually measure the diet of an animal through a whisker, and we can actually follow their diet through the length of time it takes them to grow a whisker. And it's actually, that's one reason why I was late getting here. I literally just got data on some of our downtown animals, some of which have been living in cemeteries the whole time. And I was curious as to what their diet looked like, and I thought you might be curious about that. So this is just some pictures of us handling some animals. Again, we ear tag them with uniquely numbered ear tags. We radio collar them so we can follow them. All of the adult animals get radio collars so that we can follow them through their lives and document life and death for them, as well as their movements. So we also use GPS collars, so occasionally in some of these videos or a couple of images, you'll see a larger type collar. That's a special GPS collar. Many of them are what we call cell phone collars, where we can interact with the collar or with the coyote, and we can change its schedule. It has a SIM card in it, just like your cell phones do. So we literally get locations texted to us by the coyote every week, so through AT&T. We also go into the dens, like we'll be doing next month. And we go into a den one time each season, and we get the young so we can see how big the litter is. That gives us an idea whether the population is still growing or whether it's stable. We also microchip each one of those using the same microchips that you use for your cats and dogs. So each one of those pups will be permanently marked with a unique tag that we'll be able to scan for them later, and we know exactly which den they came from, we know who their siblings are, and we collect a tiny bit, I guess a couple drops of blood for genetic work, and we're the first study to actually do genetic analyses on these animals to look at their mating system and their family structure. So these are just a few pups. So it's a 4-week-old pup that doesn't really look like a coyote yet. Their eyes haven't turned yellow, and they're very passive at this stage. You can put them in a pocket and walk away. At 5 weeks, they begin to look like a coyote. Their eyes are beginning to turn, and they're developing their personalities at that age, and you'll start to see differences in their behavior. And then that's another 5-week-old pup, and then at 6 weeks they're looking like a coyote, and at that age, then they're going to move those young out of the den for the rest of the year. So they really don't like to be in that den any longer than they absolutely have to. So we try and time it to where we can find them and get in there before they get old enough to leave, because once they get to that age, they're very difficult to get your hands on. So this is this is one of our litters. This is our litter from 851, and it looks very natural, like a typical den that you might find out in the country. But if you just turn the camera a little bit, you can see that they're actually being raised right next to a subdivision, and so that's pretty typical for our coyotes. And in cemeteries, they'll try and find the most remote part of that cemetery, the one that's the most protected, has the most woody cover. And if you have any breeding going on, then it'll be in that remote area. Just right outside of O'Hare, just across the fence from O'Hare. We had a litter of 8 in those cement pipes, another litter. So we just literally captured and yesterday I was there and we caught number 1,089, so I did update that. So we've caught over 1,000 animals, marked them, we've radio collared over 400 adults, and then the other animals have been young animals that were too small to radio collar. And then we have caught 2 dogs and 2 people. So
You mark the people when you left?
no, but those 2 people, they're interesting stories about those. They mark themselves. So they mark themselves. A lot of people are curious about the size. Everyone overestimates the size of coyotes. So if you have coyotes on your property and you have people saying, I saw a wolf on there, or I saw a coy wolf or whatever, it's not, it's just a coyote. And they're not as big as what they look like. So these are averages. So our Chicago animals are averaging about 33 pounds for males, but they've gone up to about 40, 45 pounds. I'll show you, our second largest male was a cemetery male, and he was 44 pounds. And then I have studied coyotes in Ohio. We did a rural study of coyotes in south central Ohio, and these are the numbers for Ohio. So we did have some pretty large males for the state, but nothing remarkable. So mid 30-pound range. Let me see. So one of the things that we're finding in the cities, and you'll probably find this in your cemeteries, is that the litter sizes are pretty large. So that's a litter of 11 pups taken from a single den and a single female and a single male. So they're one of the things that our studies found. In fact, we just finished another block of 6 years of analysis, and they've always been monogamous. So they only breed with a single mate, and they'll stay with that mate year-round until one of them dies. We have yet to have a single divorce in 16 years. So they're doing a lot better than some of us. So that's a single female and single male. The reason why they can pull off litters that size is that both parents are raising the young. The male is just as attentive as the female. He can't lactate, but he can provision the mother while she's lactating, and then as they start getting their baby teeth, then he'll start bringing them food as well. The males work actually extremely hard. Coyotes, a lot of people don't realize they are pack animals, but they're not pack animals in the same sense that you envision that. Usually we think of that in terms of wolves, where you have large groups of 10, 12, 16 animals. With coyotes, it's a smaller group, usually 4 or 5 or 6 animals, and they're not tied together nearly as much as say wolves are, because they're not hunting large prey usually. And even when they do hunt large prey, usually it's only the pair that will do that hunting. The offspring are not much help with that. In the city, we have small territory sizes. Most of them are less than 2 square miles. A typical coyote home range out in rural Ohio, like what we found in Pickering County, would be around 7 to 8, almost up to 10 square miles. So that's a pretty standard coyote territory. And then we have some large solitary animals that are crossing or traveling in an area as large as 200 square miles. So in other words, almost the whole northwest suburbs. So this is what it looks like real quick. This is not a cemetery yet. I'll show you one in just a second. But if you can see it with this map, we have red dots and yellow dots. Those are the locations of a single alpha male. So that's the dominant male of that group. And this is a large forest reserve. It would be a metro park in Cleveland or Columbus. And you can see that he occupies that whole territory. And so does his pack. And they're territorial, so they're excluding other coyotes from that area. That's one of the benefits to that monogamy, is that you have both dominant animals traveling together, marking together, and defending that territory from other coyotes. And you can see he's using the complete area. It'll look different when we get into the city in just a second. So those are his locations. So they're defending those through usually indirect methods like howling. That does help advertise and repel other coyotes from the territory. Scent marking, they preferentially defecate and urinate along edges of their territory, or at least the alphas do. And then rarely, but they will do it occasionally, they will attack another coyote, but it's pretty rare for them to do that. So this is his locations up there, and you can see that if we go back, these are actually the GPS locations, that's why there's more of them. But you can see the boundaries, and they conform to the boundaries of the roads. And so a lot of people would assume or interpret that to mean that that animal doesn't like to cross those roads, or he can't cross those roads. So those roads are serving as physical boundaries, but they're not. They're just using those as markers to do their marking. It's actually a social boundary. And so there are other coyotes on other sides of the roads that are preventing him, or he's preventing them from coming into that territory. So these are his locations up there. These are the locations of an alpha animal of an adjacent pack, and those are the locations of another alpha animal of adjacent pack. And you can see that they're carving up the landscape into very discrete territories. And so that's what we do, is we map out these territories across the landscape. And so this is what it looks like in 1 year. This is again up in the northwest suburbs, and some of these animals have a cemetery in their territory, some of them don't. But they're territorial, and then on top of that, you have these huge home ranges of solitary animals. And these guys are interesting. They're both males and females that have left their family groups. And what you should keep in mind always is that this massive chaos, so the resident animals are highly organized, very exclusive, maintain their boundaries year after year after year in a very dependable way. These solitary animals are completely overlapping everything. They're going through the territories and they're looking for vacancies. The reason why they're important is that when you remove coyotes from an area, it's only going to be temporary. And so no removal is going to be permanent. You just have to prepare for that. It may be that it's still the right thing to do. It still might be the right thing to remove a single animal or a couple of animals, but just keep in mind that they will be back. And it'll be through those solitary animals. Just real quick, this is coyote number 1. She started off the study. This is me recapturing her 10 years later. We followed her all the way through her life. It just happened that number 1 went for a long ways. And it was pretty hard to recapture her as well. So I won't go through the story, how she ended up with duct tape on her face and my glove in her mouth. But anyway.
You have all your fingers?
I do. Yeah, but it was questionable, so I had to jump on her because she knew how her traps work, and so she could get out. And so I had to wait behind a tree and jump on her when she got caught, and then carry her out. So this is her as a 12-year-old coyote. So it's a reminder to me to kind of let you know our coyotes, the survival rates are a lot higher in the city or in the urban areas because you don't have hunting and trapping going on in the large cities. And so consequently, they don't have any predators, and they do learn the trapping patterns and things. So their survival rate is pretty high. And so we have a lot of coyotes that actually live quite a few years. And so it's been, we've been very lucky to be able to do a long-term study and actually follow these animals through their lives. So she died just about 5 months after this. So she died as a 12-year-old. It's very rare to go out into the country here and find an animal that's older than 6 or 7, because they all get whacked pretty good. In fact, here in Ohio and most Midwestern states, we have hunting year-round and trapping for most of the year. They only have about a 30% annual survival rate. So that means that only about 30% of the coyotes at the beginning of the year will be alive at the end of the year. And if you count pups, it's only 15%. 15% of them will survive their first winter, and that's all hunting. So whereas in the city, between 60 to 70% of the pups survive their first year. So big difference. And this is where she lives. So she didn't live in a metro park or a forest preserve. She lived with people, or among people. So these are her locations. This is Schaumburg, Illinois. We're just about 4 miles from O'Hare, right here. And this is the first year that she was collared. This is the second year. She became an alpha at that stage. She became an adult. She became reproductive. That's why she shrunk her home range down. This third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, she moved out. She actually gave her poor area to her son, one of her adult sons, and he took over. And then this is her mate. And I said they were monogamous. That's the only male she mated with her whole life, and that's Melonhead. We named him Melonhead for his big head. And they stayed together until she died, and so he outlived her, so he actually lived until he was 13. And this is what it looked like the last year. So again, they spent over a decade living among people without a single conflict. They raised 7 litters. Each litter was between 8 to 11 pups, so they produced a bunch of pups without any conflict. So those are her locations, and these are his locations. They were right on top of each other because they were always together. She died, and then he moved, left his territory that he had lived in for over a decade and moved behind a super Walmart in another town. And so this is where he spent his last year, was again completely surrounded by people, and not once did they ever become habituated or used to people. So they don't all cause problems. In fact, it's rare that some of them do, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So that's the suburbs, but going into the city is again where cemeteries become really important, and so I'll show you cemeteries now. So as we move into the city, these are just GPS collared animals, and so the northwest suburbs is where we spend a lot of our time, but now we work really hard to go into the city to catch these animals, and so these are territories in the urban core. So this is road density, the roads. And so you can see how intense the road density really is. Navy Pier would be right there. And so this is just a sampling of a few animals. And you'll see a cluster up there. That's a cemetery. And this is the animal that's living in that cemetery. So that's number 740. I caught him in 2013. He was the 44, 45 pounder. So he's a big guy. And he was actually very fit. These coyotes don't get fat. So that's just a big coyote. And so that's where he lived. And so when I caught him, we didn't know that he would be living exclusively in a cemetery. So he got, especially because of his size, he got one of those really expensive cell phone collars that we can communicate with. And so we were hoping to get these great maps of his movements through the city. We had no idea that he would spend the rest of his time completely in a cemetery. But that's what he did. So he just spent like $8,000 on a collar to get locations of a coyote cemetery for years. And so this is what that looks like. So this is Roseville Cemetery, so it's 350 acres. It is the biggest cemetery in the city of Chicago, and those red dots are all his locations, so that's about $8,000 worth of a map right there. And he never took a step. This is really high resolution locations. They're down to 1 meter accuracy. So we would know if he would ever left the cemetery, but he never did. Never did. And he's not the only one. We have another one now that we were just tracking yesterday, and he is also living in that cemetery. He's not leaving either. In fact, these are his locations. You may not be able to see those, but they're little yellow dots. So that's the smallest territory that's ever been recorded for coyote, especially if it's a multi-year territory. Because you're looking at, it's only about 108 acres when you look at the actual use of the space they're using. The reason why they can do that in a cemetery is because they're getting fed. So if they weren't getting fed, they would not be able to stay there. But people are feeding them. The director of the cemetery doesn't think, they didn't know that people were feeding them. They have a lot of signage, and they've gone out there. It was originally the employees were feeding them, but then they tried to get them to stop, and now it's actually visitors. There's actually 2 little ladies that have adopted them, and so they're feeding them regularly. And it doesn't look like, shoot. Yeah, this is a video clip, but I don't think the video clips are going to work on this computer. Yeah. Anyway, you would just be able to see some of these animals. We'll see if some of them will work a little bit later. So that's Roseville. These are some of the other downtown animals. As we move in closer, for example, 748's in the yellow there. That's actually along Lakeshore Drive. And he's living right across, or was living right across from Soldier Field. The computers freezing up. So this is so it's trying to, I think it's trying to play the video clips. So these are clips. So I mentioned that coyote use of the cemeteries are going to be greatest when you have a corridor. And so some of these older cemeteries, Rose Hill is one of the oldest. I'm going to talk about the southern one on the south side of Chicago in just a minute. It's the oldest. It's 1850s. It was developed in 1850. Rose Hill is in the 1860s. But they're bordered by rail lines, or old rail lines, and that provides a corridor for these coyotes to get into the cemetery. So if you have a cemetery that has any kind of a green space or any kind of a corridor, you have coyotes. They may not be residents, but they're definitely visiting. And yeah, it's not gonna. So this is 748 that's living across from Soldier Field. This is a parking garage. It looks like it's on the ground. It's actually the top floor of a parking garage, and they actually had a litter on top of the parking garage last year. So that's Sears Tower and Soldier Field right there. So they can live pretty much throughout the city. This is the south side, Oakwood Cemetery, and the locations, you probably can't see them, they're little red dots. That's the original male. They lived there, and this is a closer view of him, but you can't really see the dots very well. The cemetery there, so there's a big difference between Rose Hill and Oakwood. So Rose Hill is very tolerant of the coyotes. The coyotes haven't caused any problems. They're not aggressive. They stay hidden during the day. Oakwood, the coyotes there are still not aggressive, but they're a bit more visible. So that cemetery did not like them and didn't want them. So they actually contracted to have them shot. And so he was shot a couple weeks after we video collared him, and he was the alpha male. And so they had a litter. So he was removed, but as I mentioned, every coyote's going to be replaced by another one. And so this was 736, and then this is 855, the blue dots. This is that cemetery, and you can see that he basically moved into that vacancy. So as soon as you pull a coyote out, another one goes right back in. And his movements go all the way up to Buckingham Fountain, so all the way up to the Field Museum. And that's his home range. It's a massive home range. And he's using the rail lines. Again, these are rail lines. That's a railroad. The reason why eventually they wanted to get rid of the other male was that they never were aggressive toward people, that they had a goose problem, and so they contracted with a goose removal company that had a goose dog. And so the dog, they were doing this during the nesting season, which is also the time they had a litter in the ground, and so the dog ran into the den, and the coyotes pushed him out. And of course the goose operator saw that and were scared for their dog, which is totally understandable. And they said they would never come back unless they killed the coyotes, and so that's why they removed him. So it was actually just tough defense was the only conflict that they had, but it was enough. So again, yeah, it's not going to show that. This would be the 855, the new male. So real quick in terms of diet, I'm up with my time, but we look at diet a couple of different ways. We do the old standard way, which is scats. We also look at their stomach content. So this is the stomach content of a single coyote. Those are 9 rodents in the stomach. The coyote that we just caught yesterday, she had 3 rabbits in her stomach. So mainly it's native prey. But stomach contents is only a one-time measure, and we can't get a good feeling for that. So again, I mentioned earlier, we collect a whisker. And so a whisker is what we can do is what we call stable isotope analysis. And without going into a lot of detail, all of us, all biological organisms are made up of nitrogen and carbon. And our nitrogen and carbon are made up of different weights or different isotopes. And our weights are determined based on what we eat, which is assimilated in terms of tissue. And so for some food items, the difference in weight is great enough that you can actually see that difference in a whisker or blood or tissue. And so here's what we call an isotopic landscape. So here are the isotopes for rabbits, deer, and bulls, squirrels, and mice. These are what we call the natural prey. And then we have all the human stuff. We have humans, we have kibble, and then we have pets. And carbon is actually the important axis here. Carbon is, again, relates to all of our food. It turns out that human food and pet food is all what we call C4, so that's basically caused by corn. So all of our food is corn-based. All of it, even food that you don't think is corn-based, is corn-based. Even livestock and other things, it's all corn-based. So all of our food has a heavy carbon signature, so that's why all of our stuff is clear over on this end. Natural foods are clear over on this end. All of these colored dots, each one of those is an individual coyote, and that's their average diet. And what we can do is see whether or not they're eating human foods. It's important because usually it's the feeding that causes coyotes to live in areas that we don't want them to live, or become habituated when we don't want them to be habituated. And so this is the first time anyone's used this technique for coyotes. And it's the most complete picture that's been presented of the diet of coyotes. And so what you can see is that most of the coyotes are on this other side of the dotted line. This dotted line is what we call the anthropogenic line, or the human diet line. So everything that's over on this side, their diet is dominated by human foods. Everything on this side is natural foods. So what we see is that there are some coyotes that are eating human foods to varying degrees. For example, that coyote has actually got the same diet that we have. It's eating the same amount of human foods that people are. The rest of them, it's more varied. But the main thing is that you see this huge scatter, and so not all coyotes are doing the same thing. So just recently, we got all of our downtown animals analyzed. And so this is what I looked at right before I came, so I'm almost done. And so some of these red dots, are all downtown coyotes, or at least the urbanized coyotes, the really urban ones. So some of these are cemetery animals. So again, some coyotes are over on the human side, a lot of coyotes are over on the natural side. The question is, are cemetery animals on the human side? And so I showed you that, or I told you that at least 740 and another animal is getting fed. Well, that is 740. So he's clear over, as far over, he's the farthest over on the human side as any coyote. So sure enough, he's not eating anything other than human food or pet food. This is 741, so that's the other male that's living in the same Rose Hill Cemetery. And again, he's getting fed. So that's an indication. Again, this is the whole length of a whisker, which is 6 to 9 months of diet. So that's 6 to 9 months of eating nothing but human food. But this is another coyote from Oakwoods on the south side, so not quite as bad. But then we have this animal, this is Oakwoods, and he's got a completely natural diet. And then another Oakwoods coyote, completely natural. There's no human food whatsoever. So there's a difference in terms of the cemeteries, in terms of the amount of human food that they're getting. So, this one's going to work. So this is what we've been cooperating with National Geographic. They've been really nice. They dedicated an engineer to build a critter cam for us to put on a coyote. So this is a camera on the neck of a coyote. You'll see its snout up above it, so it follows the direction of the head. So that's the nose as it's pointing down. And that's the cemetery. So you can see well, when he looks up, you'll see headstones. And that's what he's eating. So someone's putting out dog food. And remember, that's Rose Hill, so that's where the director was saying they don't feed coyotes there at all. So you can see his feet there. He's going to look up. You'll see. There's the graves, the headstones. So we're using another technique, so critter cams, to be able to identify food items as well. It's also eating natural prey, so this is the same cemetery, so this is Rose Hill. I edited it so you don't see him killing this, but this is natural food, again, coming from the cemetery. So I don't know if you can identify what that is that he's eating. Who said squirrel? Yeah, so it's a squirrel. Yep, and so not only are we able to kind of confirm the diet stuff and tease apart some of the natural food, but we can actually see how they eat it. So we know that he likes to eat the head of the squirrel. We also know that he doesn't eat the whole thing, probably because he's getting a lot of dog food. So he saves, so they'll cache their food. So now he's picking it up, over half of it, and he's going to spend the next 15 minutes looking for the perfect place to bury it. So he tries different places constantly until he finally finds the right spot, and then he'll go ahead and bury it, which I won't show you all that. But anyway, so that's all in a cemetery, so that's nice natural. That's predation, which is really important, which gets me really quick to the costs and the benefits. So the benefits is that they do act as a predator, and a lot of times we have animals that are out of balance, geese, a lot of rodents. We've studied all of these, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but we've spent, like for example, Canada geese, we did a 4-year study, very intensive, to be able to look at the nest predation that coyotes have. They definitely have an impact on geese. They have an impact on foxes. They have an impact on feral cats. And we're working on deer right now. So we're in our 4th year of the white-tailed deer predation study, and so it looks like they're doing their part in terms of helping to slow the growth of the deer population. What we haven't measured yet is their effect on rodents, but if you look at their energetics, we do know that a coyote has to eat about 10% of its body weight every day, and that can be transformed over into prey. So if a single coyote, ate only deer, they'd have to eat somewhere between 8 to 24 deer, the whole thing, in a year. For rabbits, it's between 160 to 480. But for rodents, you can see a single coyote, to maintain its body weight, just to maintain it, has to be somewhere between 4,800 to over 14,000 rodents. So there are huge, potentially huge impact on rodent populations. If you increase that to 4 coyotes living in a cemetery or other areas, they have to have, if they ate nothing else, no human food, no other diet, other prey items, they would be consuming almost 40,000 rodents in a year. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that occasionally there are conflicts. That's a coyote killing a chihuahua. Not in Chicago, that's over in Texas. But they occasionally get attack dogs. Again, it's rare, but it is highly seasonal. So these are data from Chicago, and these are the number of coyote attacks, reported coyote attacks on dogs. In January and February are big months. We're heading into April, which is the litter rearing period, and there's going to be another peak there. These are some of the breeds that have been attacked by coyotes. There's a big difference. There's 2 things I want you to notice. The really small dogs, like Shih Tzus and Terriers, have a higher number, but we also have big dogs. So, there's a Weimaraner, there's a Dalmatian, a Shepherd, and things like that. So, any dog can be attacked, but the larger dogs are rarely lethally attacked. They usually just get cut up. This is the small dogs that are at risk. And then, even more rare are attacks on people. So, we published a study on coyote attacks on people up through 2007. You can see that reported attacks have increased in recent years, but that's across all of the U.S. and Canada. And so we average somewhere between 3 to 4 reported attacks on a person each year in the continent in North America. So it's a pretty rare thing, and they're usually minor. There's only been 2 fatalities in the records total. It's very rare in Ohio. So for us, over in Chicago, less than 5% of our animals have caused even a complaint, much less become a threat. And so the vast majority of them are not causing any problems, but it's important to manage them. And so for land managers, like cemetery directors, the main thing is if you don't want them to stay in the cemetery, remove cover and remove food. Those are the 2 things that will allow coyotes to stay there. Managing pets is the other issue. And if coyotes are becoming more bold, you can haze them to try and increase their fear. So that's sometimes useful. Or you can remove them. And in some cases, that might be the right thing to do if they become especially aggressive, or if the level of risk is just too great that you don't want to deal with them. But it's hard to do. and it costs money to remove them. But again, it can be very specific, and some of the cemeteries are highly successful. Again, specific removal of certain individuals, usually by professionals, as the better way to go. Targeted removal as opposed to general removal, because again, any removal is going to be temporary. And usually trapping is what's usually used, but you can also use sharpshooting. In the cities, actually sharpshooting is the preferred method in most cases. It's the quickest. So again, the negatives, because of the complaints and in some rare cases an attack, but the benefits are all of those things. So again, you have to weigh the costs versus the benefits. In larger metro areas, all cemeteries have coyotes, or at least they have coyotes visiting them. So it is something you want to be aware of. Again, food and cover are the two things you want to try and manage if you don't want them there. And again, keep in mind removal is temporary. So I need to thank a lot of people, but the main thing is if you're interested in the literature that we've published, especially some of the management suggestions, we have a website, urbancoyoteresearch.com, and all of our publications are available on that website. So thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Yep.
The Rose Hill 45-pound male, did you get that big because they were feeding him? So do you have any idea how many generations that would take for coyotes to get bigger on average?
Right, so the question was, going back to that Rose Hill male, who was a big male, I was shaking my head. We don't know because he was already that big when we caught him. So we don't know if he started off there, if he was born and raised there or not. We don't know. But we do know that in general, the general trend is that we have a new animal right now. He's doing the same thing, which is they do tend to be in really good physical condition because they're getting supplemented. By the way, I haven't mentioned the other type of supplementation that is unique to cemeteries. So in addition to like the little ladies putting food out for them, there's also cultural things that go on. So Rose Hill also has an Asian part to that cemetery, Korean section, and so they do put rice and chicken, small amounts, and the coyotes definitely know that. Oakwoods has a Caribbean section to it, and so we noticed that there are people putting chickens out like twice a month and that type of thing. So there's other types of feeding that goes on in those cemeteries. So, but we do know that on an individual level, they're definitely benefiting, and they are physically, a little bit larger than our other coyotes. But in general, our urban coyotes, as a general trend, they get bigger as you move into the city. They're in great shape. They're extremely healthy, which is the opposite of that we thought we would find, and the opposite of what most people predicted. Yeah.
Anything else? So at Lakeview, I know it's hard to see, but this was my first encounter of a coyote at Lakeview. We have a wrought iron fence around part of our property, and this coyote actually got himself stuck. He went in partway and then came out right around, and he was stuck there. So we had to call the Natural History Museum, and gentleman came over and kind of sedated him, and so we were able to remove him. So, yeah, it's quite comical. But we have removed coyotes, but like Stan said, they come back in. So I think we're at a point of educating. We do open up our property for the community to walk their dogs, which they must be leashed on our property. And that is a rule that gets broken quite often. And knock on wood, we haven't had any fatalities due to the coyotes, but it's going to happen. And so that's where we're trying to educate our visitors to keep their dogs leashed, because it's going to happen. And it's they're there.
Right. It's still pretty rare. So both of those cemeteries also allow dog walkers, and they're supposed to be leashed.
Yeah.
They never are. Never.
Well,
And,
but we're using it as a good deterrent to make them
Yep.
to walk their dogs.
Right.
Just saying that there are coyotes on the property.
Same way here, because if you let the dog owners know, you
Yeah.
have coyotes.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep, it does
exactly.
make a difference, or at least if something happens, at least they already know, and
Right.
so it's kind of on them.
Well, excellent. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious, do they have much for a taste of the geese?
So the geese, so the way that they really impact the geese is through the nest predation. So they will take a few geese, but in most cases, most little geese are okay, but they are very wary of coyotes. And so they'll still stay there, but over time, if you let coyotes actually depredate their nests year after year, the geese eventually start moving away. Because actually geese want to focus on areas where they can successfully nest. So they have a really strong fidelity, so they'll come back, and in fact they'll remain in the same area over and over again. But if they can't raise young, eventually they start to try and nest somewhere else. So that's what we've seen. They inadvertently, or they eventually kind of fish them out, or they will take the occasional geese. Some geese do try and defend their nest, and the coyotes kill them.
So another positive reason to keep having the coyotes stay there instead of the
Right.
geese.
I also noticed less groundhog problems, but I noticed more coyotes.
Right.
I'm
Exactly. Yeah, no, they definitely, it's well documented, that groundhogs or woodchucks, they will wipe them out very quickly. They're usually one of the first ones to disappear. So, in ground rodents in general, we don't have a lot of ground squirrels here, but out west they have more, and they also remove the ground squirrels really quick. So, and if you have ponds, if you have muskrats, eventually we'll get to the muskrats, but it usually takes them a little bit longer. So.
Good. Okay. Oh, another
Just
question.
a quick one. So I work at a larger cemetery. We've got about 740 acres, 450, 460 are developed. Of the 300 plus undeveloped, we are adjacent to a city park. In that, say 800 to 900 acres, how many coyotes could I expect to be living there?
It depends on if you're feeding them or not.
Hopefully we're not.
Right.
But there would be ample food, all the stuff you described.
Yeah.
Plenty of everything that's there.
Right. So then it becomes a question of whether or not, so if you're not feeding them, they're not getting supplemented, that's not enough area to maintain them exclusively. So they'll use your cemetery as part of their territory.
Okay.
And so that's actually the preferred way to go, because then people don't see them all the time, and they don't start associating the cemetery with food. So that's better. But you can have situations where you could have the border, serving as a border between two paths. So you're actually getting visits coming from two different groups.
Okay.
So they will do that occasionally. So it's hard to say. But it may not seem that much because they're spending a lot of time outside of your cemetery.
The afternoon break today was sponsored by Cold Spring Memorial Group. Thank you very much. All right, who learned something? You've already learned something. I keep walking. Okay, here we go.
Talked with Eric from Tribute, some of what all that they detail and they go from